This is Elder of Zion. I am interviewing Gerald Steinberg of NGO Monitor. NGO Monitor, as my readers know, is an essential organization to be able to essentially act as a watchdog to all of the non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty, Human Rights Watch. They do a really excellent job, and I'm very happy to be able to interview Gerald. So thank you very much for taking this time. Can you just tell us, how did NGO Monitor start?
Well, first of all, Elder, I'm very happy to be interviewed by you.
Thank you.
With all of your accomplishments. It's a small group of people who are doing a lot of work, and I think maybe not the analogy of putting fingers in dikes is probably not the right one, but fighting a very important battle. NGO Monitor has a very clear origin, and that was the Durban NGO Forum 2001, in which 1,500 organizations under the category of non-governmental NGO organizations, many of which were funded by governments, met in Durban to declare the end of apartheid and the beginning of Israel apartheid week, year, decade. And when I first heard about this, and it was a sort of a side conversation, it's not something I ever paid attention to, I said, "Oi, this is really serious. This is a major new attack on Israel." Pieces were already there, but to see this happening, and the text they came up with, what we call now the Durban strategy, pounding away using terms like apartheid, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, genocide. We now see it. We look back 12 years plus, and you see how these organizations have driven it. And we basically, NGO Monitor evolved as a response to that.
I don't recall it, that specifically as you do, obviously, the Durban conference, but were any of the major NGOs that, Amnesty, HRW, were they involved in that as well?
In fact, HRW and Amnesty made the difference between having a marginal event with a lot of groups but nobody important and putting this on the agenda. Ken Roth of Human Rights Watch went on the radio, National Public Radio, and talked about how wonderful this conference was, had been. And HRW people on the ground, particularly someone by the name of Reed Brody, who was, I think, a legal advisor at the time, very close to Ken Roth, very involved in these things, was involved in preventing some of the Jewish and people who are not anti-Israel, one might even call them pro-Israel, individuals who went there in this huge group of 5,000 people. Ann Bayevsky documented the way that she was shouted down, and Reed Brody was very much part of that process. So HRW was acting very much as an instigator, as a legitimizer of this declaration of war against Israel.
So I didn't realize that Human Rights Watch was that antagonistic even that far back. This was obviously after Bernstein. Robert Bernstein must have left at that point, or was it before he left?
He hadn't left yet. What he had done was he said he was disengaged from anything other than his involvement in China. He'd retired. He said, I wasn't really following. And when he did find out from us what HRW was doing, he re-engaged.
Very interesting. So essentially, okay, so it started with Durban. So what is NGO Monitor's strategy in countering these anti-Israel NGOs?
There are two basic approaches. One is naming and shaming. Sort of taking the same strategy these NGOs use to try to isolate, sometimes justifiably and successfully. When China kills protesters in Tibet and refuses to allow other ethnic minorities and the Tibetans to have any kind of human rights or political rights, that kind of naming and shaming has an impact. Of course, China can usually ignore that. But when NGOs violate those same moral principles, then they need to be named and shamed. When they isolate Israel, when they basically lie, they make up things, they use double standards. So we spend a lot of our time exposing very clearly the naming and shaming when, if we're talking about Human Rights Watch, the head of their Middle East, North Africa division, Sarah Leah Whitston, calls Gaddafi, goes to Libya and calls the Gaddafi family human rights reformers, and does all sorts of other things in that realm to legitimize them. That's an easy mark for naming and shaming, except nobody else did it. So we do that across the board.
Okay, that's one strategy.
And the other strategy is, because most of the people involved are hardcore committed ideologues, without really focusing on universal values of human rights. So we're not going to change their views. But we can't go to the donors. We can go to the support network, the people who don't follow the details, and say, is this really what your money is supposed to be used for? Is this really what you want your name and your institution to be associated with? It started with the Ford Foundation that paid a lot of the money for the Durban conference, the Canadian government. and both of which were named and shamed in part, but also said, okay, we're not going to do this again, turning off the spigot. And that's a very significant part. Now it's mainly European governments, and slowly but surely we are exposing what they're doing and forcing them to reallocate their funding, or at least make it public.
So I've been noticing you've certainly been doing a lot of, naming European governments as, as funders of the various NGOs, and or even not, like Ma'an or whatever. There's, that when they come out with an anti-Semitic article, that we just like, hey, and that's, I think that's very effective to be able to say that this is, look what's being funded, and that, I think that's tremendous. What would you say has been the top 2 or 3 successes of NGO Monitor?
I'll go back to, first of all, after Durban, having the Canadian government, having the Ford Foundation pull out of funding for all these groups. Took a little bit of time, but it was important. There was supposed to be, there were 2 follow-up conferences to Durban, but there was no significant NGO forum. The ability to, in terms of naming and shaming, talking to people and getting people who do have that same moral commitment, like Robert Bernstein, to denounce his own organization. Convincing with a lot of effort to Judge Richard Goldstone that the report that has his name, that was based on almost entirely NGO claims that had no foundation, to say, wait a minute, that report's got real problems. Had I known what I know now, I wouldn't have written the report.
And so NGO Monitor was specifically involved in contacting Goldstone for that?
We had a role in that process.
Okay.
And I think a significant role in constantly showing how the contradictions. I think that was one of the main points that Goldstone saw, was that this wasn't going to go away, and it was getting worse as more and more information was made available, showing the contradictions between what was in the report that had his name on it and what all the evidence actually showed. We've had, I think, some successes with European funders, and certainly the British government has cut back on some of the organizations that are involved in this process. Not enough, and transparency, and that's the next step. It used to be all hidden.
Right.
Europe was funding, we guess, maybe it's a little bit exaggerated, a little bit high now, maybe 100 million euros. We're talking about Europe, which is almost bankrupt. Right. Just to Israeli and Palestinian NGOs with absolutely nothing to show for it. And it was all secret. Now, at least the funding is public. The documents are still secret. We're working on that.
So you obviously you were a lot behind the Israeli law for the NGO transparency.
One of the biggest problems was this was all being done in secret. It was so absurd. Organizations and their funders, enablers, that claim to be promoting moral values, good government, democracy, human rights, were doing everything in absolute top secrecy with the most absurd excuses. And so being able to show that, get it out in the open, has had a significant impact. It's
one of the, I don't know, I haven't looked at it, but I remember seeing at least one anti-Israel pundit criticizing NGO Monitor, saying that you weren't as transparent as you want all the other NGOs to be. How would you respond to that?
If you're blind and you want to see and claim to see whatever curtains in front of people behind the black box, Wizard of Oz analogy doesn't quite work. You can come up with anything. Anybody who looks at our website, looks at our 990 forms in the U.S., looks at our submissions to the Israeli nonprofit authorities, knows that we are fully transparent, produce all the documents on time, unlike these other groups. When you look at these groups, and some of them, under Israeli law, the Israeli groups are supposed to report. They used to be they could report 2 years late. Some of them haven't reported since 2008 because there's no sanctions, because they don't need a tax receipt, because they're getting money from Europe, and Europe doesn't submit 990 forms. But with the new transparency law now, they have to submit on a quarterly basis, and we follow the same rules. The purpose of promoting a much more efficient transparency law for foreign funding, first of all, Israel's just deluged. When you're talking about 100 million from euro, so that's what, $130 million a year, to about 100 different groups, all located in one part of the spectrum, political spectrum. That's a lot of money. It has a big impact on Israeli policy, on the way Israel's perceived. Let's at least put this information on the table. And it was not being done in an efficient and credible manner. So we did sponsor and convince a number of members of the Knesset. It was a cross-party issue. It wasn't just the right-wing conspiracy. that this was important. And then we were the only ones so far who've actually monitored. It's one thing to say you have to report, but if nobody looks at the data,
Sure.
and what we see is the evidence of all this huge money coming in.
Do any other nations have similar transparency laws?
Well, first of all, no other country has this deluge. No other democratic country has this type of manipulation, and in secret from other democratic countries. The United States has a Foreign Agents Registration Act. One can argue that there are differences, and I agree with that, but there are also some similarities.
Right.
These are foreign agents in the sense that they function according to the interests and priorities of foreign governments. So if an NGO that promotes other issues, let's say the Land of Israel Legal Land of Israel Forum for the dealing with rights of people in Judea, Samaria, etc., they're not going to get money from the EU anyway.
Right.
So it's having that concentration, making it visible, all of those issues. Those are things that Israel does have to take seriously, and I think in a unique context. So, yes, there's a comparison of the United States in terms of the foreign agents element, but it's also something that Israel does have to deal with in a manner that is quite different than other countries.
And that's certainly true. I mean, obviously, I mean, we see it. I mean, the politics is what drives everything, and Europe has been, in many ways, certainly antagonistic towards many of Israel's policies. So,
and the fact that they do it all on the sly. Mm-hmm. There are no hearings in the European Parliament. The European Union maybe provides 10 million euros a year mm-hmm. to about 30 or 40 groups.
Right.
There are no hearings. Mm-hmm. It's all secret.
Right.
And when members of Parliament ask for it, they're told, no, you can't have it. It might harm public security, which is all nonsense.
Yeah. So how does the EU? So are these specific EU countries? I was under the impression of specific EU countries. You're saying the EU itself.
There's the EU, and then there are about 15 of the old Europe, the Western European countries.
Yeah.
Particularly Scandinavia, all the way down south to Spain. Mm-hmm. And they more or less copy each other. So if you look at B'Tselem, and I don't know right offhand, but I would guess they may have 10 different European government funders.
Right.
So it's, well, in Hebrew we say chaver maybe chaver, one friend brings another, and it's all, as I said, it's almost all done entirely, has been done entirely in secret. Mm-hmm. So it's important to get at it. My sense is that if other countries knew what was going on or had the same kind of target, they would respond the same way. I'll just give one example.
Sure.
Canada, Canadians found out recently that I think it was Europe was funding a environmental NGO that was operating in Canada. And the details are not important. It was the fact that here we have a foreign country or a group of foreign countries mm-hmm. trying to influence Canadian energy policy. Mm-hmm. And they were outraged by this, and rightfully so. Mm-hmm. That's not the way democratic countries behave, by funding a political interest group operating in another democratic society in order to change the policies of that society.
What about, are there NGOs that are funded by non-democratic governments, by repressive governments?
Well, we know that, for instance, Libya, again, going back to Gaddafi, used to fund the Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize. Mm-hmm. And it would give it to all sorts of shady international characters that promoted their interests. So there are some exceptions, but in most cases you don't have Russia, China, these are not on their agenda. It's mostly a Western democratic, mainly European phenomenon.
Okay.
There's been a source of concern that, like in other issues, the Obama administration is kind of becoming a little more like Europe.
Yes.
And what we've seen since 2008 is the beginnings of U.S. State Department funding for some of these NGOs. And we've had some serious conversations. Some of it has been stopped. I think the State Department was really embarrassed when they had this textbook incitement study that was completely mishandled in the way it was released and the way it was written. All of those things. It was a bogus study that got a lot of headlines. Mm-hmm. And it shows how these NGOs can completely get out of hand. So I think it's important to watch what the State Department does. That's what we're doing also. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. government, to make sure that they don't fall into the same kind of abuses that are characteristic of Europe.
Very good.
Again,
yeah.
I think one of the most important things we've done is to set precedents on all sorts of issues. Put information out there. So, for instance, your own work is often either you're ahead of us or you take things that we use or vice versa. But the blogosphere, some serious journalists, some government officials, even the Israeli government, now are aware, there's a lot more awareness that these are political organizations disguised as moral watchdogs or legal experts. And so definitely a large part of what we do is just try to trigger other groups, other organizations, other individuals to take a close look. If we publish material on the foreign funding for Israeli NGOs, the goal is to have, whether it's Israeli journalists or other think tanks or academics, start to work on the same issue and find things, going deeper and deeper into it and then changing the policies. I think we're pretty good at that. Also,
I love the just the database you have of the NGOs that you're watching, having that online. So that's really a great resource.
And I'm going to encourage people, we often get, not from you, but you will get a request, do you know anything about Group X?
Yeah.
Well, first look at our A to Z database, which is right there. You can see it on the home page, pull it down, and then if you don't find it, then we'll
sure.
help. So that's, I encourage...
It does need to be more publicized, for sure.
I encourage people to use it. It's about 150 groups that we have on there, and if we don't have somebody important on there, we'll put them on.
Yep.
I find it amazing that I'll give a talk to people who are committed to Israel, who come on various missions, synagogue missions, other groups, and I start talking about it, and they say, wait a minute, I've been giving to Amnesty for 20 years, you mean that was wrong? Or Oxfam, look at the organizations that you may know something, you may have some interest in, according to our information. Look at the countries that are involved in funding, especially if you're from one of those countries. We have the next category is NGO funders, government donors, foundations. The New Israel Fund has a very positive reputation in some communities in the United States, but unfortunately many of the donors only know about what the NIF tells them about where the money goes. We have independent, carefully verified information that even the NIF leadership sometimes uses and say, wait, we didn't know about this. This is not where we want to go. And that's a good thing, but they need to do more of this. So the information is out there. Our reports on monographs are prominently displayed on the front page, and if anybody wants to read everything there's to know about lawfare, not to duplicate what's out there, monograph is there. On Human Rights Watch, it's out there.
And you also write op-eds and try to drive people that way, which is also very important.
All sorts of different ways to get the issues out there and to create enough of a debate so that they don't have a monopoly.
Sure.